Thank you. Thank you very much, Bernard, and a warm welcome to all of you. I'm actually calling in from Kenya, but from a remote rural place, and my internet, for some of you, maybe shaky here and there, so I could switch off my camera at one point. Let me go straight into screen sharing mode. Bernard, if you can could confirm that you can see my slides.
Yes.
Okay, excellent, perfect. Right. Well, transdisciplinary research, that's what I was asked to talk about. And in writing this presentation, Bernard and Fabio and colleagues have realized how challenging it actually is, and that many on this call would have been in a much better position to talk about it, regardless of the fact that I'm teaching it at the university. I think what probably led us to this presentation is the work we did with CIFOR-ICRAF, the review on transdisciplinary approaches in agroecology, and what we can learn for those in terms of capacity. And I won't talk about that, but more of my meta level understanding of transdisciplinarity. Nothing is hammered in granite here. It's really an input into our conversation. I'll take less than 15 minutes for that. And I would like to say and acknowledge Lynette Iboso, who is on the call here, with whom I did work on this piece of research that I've just mentioned. Now, transdisciplinary research, in my perspective, isn't a new thing. And Bernard, you have hinted on it already. I mean, there's literature on it. There's the innovation systems literature, but before that, there's the farmer first literature, started by Chambers and colleagues. Beyond farmer first revisited. There's action research. There's participatory plant development as a specific method, just to pick out one example. So transdisciplinarity isn't new, and it shouldn't be new in agroecology, given its three pillars: science, the practice, and the movement. Nevertheless, I think it's important to talk about it, and I would like to put forward three arguments. The first argument really is that the solutions to the complexity of problems really require transdisciplinarity. And that wouldn't surprise us. But the second argument then makes a point regarding its definition and assessment. I'm proposing that we define it holistically and then also make headway regarding understanding it, and that could lead us towards measurement. So I'll talk about the framework here. And number three, in order to get transdisciplinarity into our minds and hearts and organizations, no matter whether we are a research organization, a university, a farm organization, a cooperative, or an NGO, we need behavior change, and I'll have a slide on that one too. But let's go straight into the first argument, and that's really where I take a step back and make reference to Ross Ashby, a psychiatrist and a system thinker and someone who became famous for cybernetics. He wrote a lot about systems already 50 years ago. Now, translating his insights into our world would mean what you see on the screen. Solutions must match the complexity of the system. And this is actually a simple proposition. Depending on how we define complexity, here I define it by actors and interconnectedness. Others here in the room would define it by scale, maybe the dynamic nature of systems, the adaptiveness of those. But here I define it as interconnectedness and diversity of actors. And my argument here is that the more diverse the actors landscape and the more interconnected the parts, the more we are up here in this upper quadrant. High complexity, compounding dynamics, and that's where actually transdisciplinarity found its home. Now, if you take Steve Klisman's levels of transition that many of us know about. You know, the lowest level of transition is really transaction, substitution. We change, we embrace quick fixes. The degree of transdisciplinary in that lower left quadrant may be rather less. That's not to say that it's not needed, but it may vary in the research process. There may be consultations at the beginning, depending on who runs the research. Then the implementation is done by researchers, and then there will be tests going on. But the further we go up from the left lower quadrant to the upper higher quadrant, the more we increase complexity. The more we go into food systems and the transformations we want to see, the more important transdisciplinarity becomes, because there are no simple solutions for those. It's not one body of knowledge, one epistemology that would actually help craft solutions, but it's a collective effort. And the real world lab that come out of the sustainability research domain now become more important in agroecology as well, are one prominent example. And I call this the transition complexity relation because the higher we move up in the transition ladder of Steve Klisman, the more transformative we become, the more complex things get, the bigger demand for transdisciplinarity. I'll put this forward. Please contradict me afterwards in a discussion. It's up for debate. Now, how much do we actually see in the literature on transdisciplinary research? And I've done a quick review, just looked at one platform, Science Direct. There are others. The trend lines may look differently. Here on that X, you see the publication counts, and I started off counting from 2000 to 2023. I left out 2024. And you can see, well, agroecology is actually doing pretty well. There's been kind of a constant growth, but then a takeoff in the year 2008-9 to over 1,000 publications a year. So that's just for publications that mention the term agroecology. And again, I didn't look at all those papers, so it's just a publication count, yeah, that use the term, nothing more. It's no content analysis at this stage. Now, transdisciplinary research is second. Similar takeoff around year, well, a bit later actually, 2014-15, but also going upwards, but slightly less. Now, I was wondering, whether these terms connect. So I looked at transdisciplinary research and agroecology. Played around with the terms a bit, but what it seems that the two concepts rarely appear together in publications that are published under Science Direct. As I said earlier, there may be other platforms where these trend lines look differently. But to me, this is quite an interesting. It's not an insight, but an observation I'm making, because we could argue, well, the transdisciplinarity already is part of agroecology. It's encoded in the principle number 8 out of the 13 principles on agroecology. So why talk about it? But you could also argue for a need to do research differently, to bring more transdisciplinarity in this upper curve, the rise of agroecology in the literature. And this, I believe, starts off with the definition. And what we first need to do is really define transdisciplinary research under the context, or in the context of agroecology, holistically, and then also assess it holistically. For those who have seen the earlier slides, I've flipped definition to assessment, because at the end we want to understand, how much transdisciplinarity actually is in our partnership, is in our work. And a very good starting point eventually is the HLPE definition, the High-Level Panel of Expert definition 2019, that says transdisciplinarity goes beyond disciplinary confines. right? So it's not multidisciplinarity, it is not interdisciplinarity, but it's also, you know, bringing on board other forms of knowledge. I think that's an important component of you know, the way we should define transdisciplinarity. It aims for transformative results to tackle real-world issues, and it comes up with a new methodological framing. It's not just sequencing methods to help us generate insights, collect data, convert this into information, and generate knowledge, but it is a new form of you know, collaborative effort between those different knowledge systems, and that requires a new methodology. So that's it. That's a starting point that I would like to put forward here. The HLBE definition of transdisciplinary, slightly adapted. I took this from our report. But if I operationalize this this definition, I would look at five central aspects. I would look at knowledge, you know, how knowledge is being integrated. I would look at the type of collaboration, then the degree to which problems are being, real-world problems are being addressed, and who actually defines what is a real-world problem, innovation and impact. So let's look at those five dimensions, or I call them characteristics briefly. So integration of knowledge basically looks at the degree to which various disciplines and knowledge systems are effectively collaborating, working together in agroecology research. And that means acknowledging and actively working with different theoretical perspectives, epistemologies, and also ways of reasoning, ways of knowing. So that's number one, integration of knowledge. Number two, collaboration. I mean, we all talk about collaboration and partnership, but it's the depth and breadth of collaboration that actually matters throughout the research cycle. It may change at some point throughout the cycle, but you know, getting a hand on whether we are in a consultative mode, basically asking questions. Some say this is already a partnership, or whether it is the problem definition that's being developed jointly. You know, there's a big difference between the two. Yeah, Robert Chambers used to ask, now whose knowledge counts? Yeah, so it falls into that one too, that the collaboration. Then problem-solving orientation. You know, are we doing research just for the sake of gaining insights, or are we tackling real-world challenges that where solutions are practical enough and applicable? And that, to me, that goes beyond confirmative research. There's so much research where we actually know what the likely outcome is, and I think often we are tackling with research actually an information dissemination challenge, or a power asymmetry regarding access to what is already known. Number four, innovation. I think transdisciplinary research should focus on innovation at methodological level, and that means actually going beyond the traditional norms of traditional disciplines, and again, bringing a lot of insights from the innovation systems literature on board. And number five is impact. You know, it's if agroecology research in agroecology that works with the movement, that works with the practitioners, doesn't produce tangible impact through all the four other characteristics, I think we'd have to kind of revisit our investment and prioritization priorities or standards. So putting everything together into one framework, you know, could help us developing for each of the characteristics indicators, and then engage those for a reality check to really understand, you know, when we do research in partnership, when we have our projects, what is actually in it. So we could look at the diversity of knowledge contributions, yeah, at the different stages of the research. We can, in collaboration at the actors' diversity and the quality of interactions, and also the power balances amongst actors. Who actually decides what the problem is, what methods we're going to use? And are there ways to reconcile conflicts? No? And finally, I'll just jumping down to 5. Impact, does the research really have transformative potential? And what makes us believe that this is the case? And then we can start rating those. There are various ways of doing this. This is work in progress, and I would love to get your response and feedback on this. But it's a framework for checking whether the reality in our minds regarding transdisciplinarity is also the one that matches with the indicators we look at. That takes me to the third argument. Bringing transdisciplinarity into our minds, hearts, and organizations requires a new behavior or new behaviors. And that's probably the most difficult one. I argue we need at least 3 things: interest, capacity, and capability. And if I would ask you, what's the most important one, or where do also donors invest most in it? My response would be capacity. There's a lot of capacity building or capacity development around, and that would be the most spontaneous reaction to what's most important out of the 3. But if I think a little bit deeper, I would say it's actually interest. I think that's where it starts. You don't hire for skills, right? If you're working in HR, you hire for attitudes. So attitude is part of that interest landscape that comes with human values, the core beliefs of people, basically ways of seeing the world. I think that's, we must change the way we see the world, and that's closely linked to changing the way we define interests, and refine our core values in this regard, because the core values are almost like our operating system when it comes to behavior. Second, capacity. Yes, there need to be resources. There need to be time. Engagement is time intensive. I still remember 25 years ago when I worked in a PRA, participatory rule, operational mode, participatory learning and action. People told me, Michael, it takes too much of our time. We can do that quicker and faster. Yeah. So we need to allocate resources. All parties need to do that. The farm organization, the consumers, the researchers, people working in the policy space. The engagement processes are resource intensive. For this, we need capacity. And the third one is capability. This is where the skills and the ability to maneuver, to navigate the transdisciplinary research processes come into the picture. I believe it needs all 3 and probably a few more in order to get transdisciplinarity in our organizations. The way I define it here, the most important one, I think, is interest. If there's no interest or no authentic, plausible association or attachment with transdisciplinarity, even capacity and capability won't help us. And for doing so, and for conducting actually research differently in that transdisciplinary spirit, we need to transform ourselves. And that starts with a broad societal conversation about the type of research we want to put forward and how to do research differently. That also requires a commitment to fail, to fall, stand up again, keep walking, try something different. And with that, Bernard and Fabio, I think, back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Super interesting. I think I'm going to hand it over to Bridget, who will now facilitate a panel discussion in reaction to your presentation. So, Bridget, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fabio, for handing over to me. And thank you, Michael, for a most inspiring presentation. And also for sharing the framework ahead of the workshop for all of us to have a look at. in working through it and in listening to your presentation, it's raised three things for me, and they really are interrelated. The first thing is that I think it's really important for us to reflect on our own work. I look at how many projects we perceive to be certainly multidisciplinary, but the extent to which researchers from different sectors are actually collaborating and actually co-creating knowledge, and the extent to which they're actually drawing on each other's knowledge is often questionable. And then that made me think that actually it starts right at the beginning of proposal writing. And maybe we need to be asking the question of, to what extent are we really developing proposals in a transdisciplinary way? And then I thought that maybe one of the main problems with why we have a lack of real collaboration is that, or what underpins real collaboration, is respect, a respect for each other's views, for our needs, our interests. And then I thought, well, if we're talking about respect, then it's not just about, for example, natural scientists and social scientists respecting each other, but it's also clearly a need to respect the needs of other stakeholders. So, for example, if there's private sector or companies that are involved as one of the stakeholder groups, what do they need for them to remain involved? And what about farmers? What are their needs? They're interested in impacting on their livelihoods and their land, basically. And maybe the other aspects are less important to them. And that brought me back to the work that myself, as part of ProLinova, and members, we're a network that promotes local innovation, and we promote participatory approaches, in particular farmer-led joint experimentation or innovation. And I thought to myself that most of those characteristics of the framework for transdisciplinarity have a direct alignment with what we try to get out of participatory innovation development or joint farmer-led experimentation. Because, we start off, we want to integrate different forms of knowledge, including farmer knowledge, and we want to collaborate in a meaningful way, and we want to solve real-life problems, and certainly we want to look at innovation. We want to look at ways of co-developing new or better ways of doing things. And lastly, we obviously want to have impact, and we want to see application of things that are developed through these co-creation processes. So, what I realized is that this framework that's been developed has application at many different research, within many different research contexts. And I think that that's very interesting and very valuable. And with that, I'd like to move across to our panelists and give them an opportunity to share their views on transdisciplinarity within the agroecology sector and on transdisciplinarity in particular. So I'd like to start. I've got a number of questions which I'd like to pose. The first one I'd like to pose to Francisco and to Lillian. Francisco is, now I'm going to be tested. Francisco is from Universidad Intercultural Maya de Quintana Roo. My effort there. And Lillian, you from University of Hohenheim. So I wanted to pose a question to both of you. I mean, we've had this presentation and we've heard about this way of reflecting on or assessing transdisciplinarity. I'd like to ask the question, how do you find this framework differs from earlier or current thinking on transdisciplinarity? Thank you.
You want to go first, Lillian, please?
All right. Hello, everyone. I really celebrate that so many people are here and this high interest in agroecology and transdisciplinarity. And yeah, to your question, I think this framework is novel, and the strength of this framework is really that it goes beyond a normative definition, and I think also goes beyond like the discourse of a shift of paradigms, but it really elaborates on these different characteristics and dimensions of transdisciplinary approaches, and that makes it possible to analyze and reflect on the own work in this perspective that there's a range of implementation and ways of implementing transdisciplinary research, and it's really important to communicate about the quality of it and of these different characteristics it involves, and there's many different aspects. So to improve the transdisciplinary quality, and yeah, I think this is really nice to have this differentiated elaboration on the different dimensions of what involves transdisciplinary approaches.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Michael, for sharing your presentation in a very well organized and thoughtful way. Here are my first reactions. First, you couldn't avoid to connect co-creation with transdisciplinary. They have to come in a natural way. You started mentioning at least 3 principles to guide this process of transdisciplinarity. And my take on it is that the use of the concept of transdisciplinary research is a way for scientists to understand what we, other group of scientists, call it an intercultural process of co-creation. What basically you are saying in your presentation is that transdisciplinary reaches the highest level when you have different ways of learning and creating knowledge. And for having different ways of creating for learning and creating knowledge, you have to throw in the factor of culture necessarily. And when we get into that field of culture, then things get a little bit more complicated. And because the definition of culture is so broad that we can get lost. When we talk about co-creation, only the word co-creation of knowledge, we do co-creation when any of us published a paper with 2 or more authors, regardless whether these authors are from the same field of research, are from this specific field of research. It's co-creation. But that's not the type of co-creation that you are talking about in transdisciplinary way, or what we talk about in intercultural co-creation of knowledge. We have to reach beyond that. And that implies learning different, first, number one, assuming, understanding, and accepting that there are different ways of creating knowledge. One way I say this is that if you see a picture of conventional agriculture, for instance, there is a lot of research behind that picture. Research on soil, research on pests, research on whatever, you name it. And when you see a picture of a traditional farm system, a traditional agroecosystem, without any use of the conventional inputs, there is also knowledge behind that picture. But that knowledge doesn't come necessarily from the scientific method, comes from a different way of creating that knowledge. So when we talk about transdisciplinary research, I assume that it is basically the same as saying intercultural co-creation of knowledge, in which different ways of learning, creating, innovating, and transmitting knowledge come together in a safe environment to create something new. That is one way to say transdisciplinarity. Another way to say it is that when we talk about biochemistry, for instance, the science of biochemistry, biochemistry and other sciences emerge in the process of combining different fields of science, creating something new. But this creation comes from the same paradigm, same way of thinking, same background, same science. What we're talking about here goes beyond that because it puts cultures together. It puts different ways of learning together. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe to add on that, I think one very important aspect you mentioned is the innovation part in the ways of doing science, in the scientific methodology, and I think that's really interlinked to everything what inclines a transdisciplinary approach. Is we need different methods to integrate different kinds of knowledge, different knowledge systems. And that implies also a learning process. So I think that framework is really useful to guide through this learning process to do science differently by elaborating it more, differentiated what it means, and also to introduce kind of a transition process. Because of course we also need a scientific transformation process when we want to go from business as usual, doing science with business as usual, to this doing science transdisciplinary and integrating these different knowledge systems. So that is not like we don't go from the state how it is now, how business as usual is, to a vision, maybe like it is described in the definition of transdisciplinary research, but we go through this transformation process, and I think it's really nice to have this tool to reflect on ourselves and to understand how we can improve it more and more, to implement it in very complex realities where we also need to go through learning processes.
Thank you, Lillian. Thanks to Francisco and Lillian for your thoughts on this. I'm going to go across to our other two panelists, Jane from Ignite and Lauren from the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. Right, thank you. Easier when I can see you both. Thanks so much. Just wanted to get an idea, given the potential benefits of carrying out a diagnosis using this framework or an assessment using this framework, in what instances do you envision this framework being useful within your own context and the type of work that you're involved with? Thank you, and either of you can take the floor.
Lauren, do you want to go first or do you want me to go? Okay, well, I was excited, really. Michael, thank you for your presentation and the prior comments. And the program that I run is called the Global Collaboration for Resilient Food Systems. And it used to be called, some of you may know, the Collaborative Crop Research Program. So we've been funding research as a means to support food security, food sovereignty, biodiversity preservation, et cetera, in 3 regions of the world, in the high Andes, West Africa, and East and Southern Africa since the 80s. And the trajectory of this program has been very similar to some of the trajectories you'll see around transdisciplinarity, which starts from an interdisciplinary perspective that we can solve, or a disciplinary perspective that we can solve this problem, to the realization that we have to cross disciplines, to the realization that we need to participate with others that are deeply engaged in the issues that the research is around, to ultimately ending in transdisciplinarity. And so for me, when I saw the framework, I really appreciated it. It's aligned with a lot of the thinking that we've been developing over these decades. And in 2013, I think we really started trying to Prolanova as an inspiration, but how do we really center farmers as key actors and leaders in the research process? So we started building on the decades of this trajectory to advance an idea of farmer research networks, where now we've been able to support over 38 farmer research networks that range from 15 to 2,000 farmers engaged with scientists, with NGO extension and other stakeholders, really truly in a transdisciplinarity, approach. We haven't used that word, but that's what it is. And so we developed principles to guide our work back in 2013. And so when I saw the framework, I thought, this is really helpful. It's a great rubric for us to be able to, as a touchstone, to be able to kind of check our work. And we've done similar kind of assessments of our work, and we've learned some things about it, right? And so, for example, in applying this framework, which I think most easily resonates with the research community, from a formal university, scientific research center, maybe NGO folks also, but not saying that farmer groups, other stakeholders can't do it. Just the language is set up in a way that it's a certain kind of paradigm. So maybe we need other versions of this, other descriptors. I would also say that, so in applying it, which I'm excited to do, there are things I would tweak. And the other piece of this is who is actually deciding how you're going to answer these questions, who's at the table, what are the processes, what are the relationships you have with people that you're answering this with. I mean, it gets very complex quickly. And I think it's all, we've all been engaged in participatory research probably for the most part, and we know how to address some of those things, but I think we have to tend to that. And then just the last thing I would say is, I think part of this that's so critical are mindsets, and that was mentioned before, and it's the third point, Michael, that you have. And I think that a little more of that could be reflected in the framework. But, maybe it's something we could all continue to workshop together. I know today's going to address it too. So I'll pass it over to Lauren.
Great, thanks, Jane, and thanks, Bridget. Michael, that was a wonderful presentation, and I think the framework is really strong and useful, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that we'll have together about it. So I think there are these questions, Jane, that you also elevated. How do we work collectively? How do we forge insights together, the insights that we need? What does inciting action look like through participatory research and through transdisciplinarity? There are, of course, some of the same questions that Jane had that I would echo. Who is defining the research problem? And then what are the limitations of our conventional scientific methods? So I think within this framework, we do need to talk about how our institutions, our research institutions and other institutions, funding institutions, need to change so that we can move toward transdisciplinarity. Michael, you started your presentation by talking about by saying that that solutions must match the complexity of the system, and I was responding to that by saying the answer to complexity is diversity. Francisco, you mentioned this as well. We need different ways, people with different ways of experiencing the world around the table. We need different ways of thinking. We need the ways that different languages help us experience the world, the way people live in different places, help us interpret both problems and solutions. So how do we really articulate that in the framework? And I think you've done that in this, like through the indicators that you've and the kind of questions that you're asking, and how do we pull out some of these cross-cutting themes a little bit more clearly? When I was thinking about how this would be applied, I was thinking about kind of three pieces of work. One is the politics of knowledge I can put that we led at the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, which was really lovely, transdisciplinary, not maybe as we could have gone farther, but a very, very transdisciplinary experience. And Francisco, you're extending that experience by developing an intercultural methodology, which I'm really excited about. So that could add to this conversation. Also, a piece of work led by colleague Maria Bustamante, who has taken systems thinking and complexity science to understand how we can strengthen food systems frameworks. And I think that work, Michael, can also inform the framework that you've used and inform this kind of broader project that we're all engaged in, this conversation that we're engaged in around transdisciplinarity. And thank you, TPP, for sparking this off. And then the third is really, you know, a lens through which I'm increasingly trying to see the world and see this work, which is around living in Indigenous sovereignty and, you know, thinking about decolonization. And I think that though some of the themes there you've touched on, Michael, really nicely, but they could be also drawn out. And I'll just mention a couple of them. Are, you know, around how we decolonize methodologies, how we change the way that we see the world. And Michael, you're referring to this really, I think, in your interest principle. You know, how do we bring ourselves to this work? How do we acknowledge the power and history, the power relationships, power dynamics, and the kind of history that we're living? That's about kind of telling the truth in transdisciplinary research and action. It's about learning differently, and it's about also acknowledging the land. It's about practicing humility and listening. Bernard, you said this at the beginning of your introductory remarks about taking responsibility, about willing to take risks and to engage in direct action. So I just wanted to think from these two dimensions. One is how transdisciplinarity can help us reshape our institutions so that we can truly be transdisciplinary, and how we can, how this framework can also help us decolonize methodologies so we can recognize more clearly power and historical dynamics and legacies as we approach research.
Thank you, Lauren. Thanks so much to the panelists. I think we're going to close it there because we've taken up our time slot, but wanted to say thanks very much for very inspiring discussion. Thank you.